Last question. In the history of monetary thought, leading up to the innovation of Keynes, who do you think were the great minds or the great thinkers?
Well, there are some. Keynes, of course. You asked me about this book. Macmillan, the publisher, has a book called Great Thinkers in Economics, a series of books. And they asked me to do the one on John Maynard Keynes, and this one on Marx and Adam Smith, and so on and so forth. And obviously, if you could take a history of economic thought, Adam Smith has great ideas. Ricardo is a little less, I should point out. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about law of comparative advantage, which was one of the terrible mistakes that Ricardo made. Marx, of course, had some ideas about capitalism, which partly were correct and partly wrong. Obviously, the worker proletariat didn't work as the Soviet Union found out.
Talk about Ricardo and comparative advantage.
Right.
What you said you thought that was a flawed notion.
Oh yeah, it's a terribly flawed notion. In the old days, trade was always agricultural products. And it's clear that with climate control and things like that, it was true that you could be more productive if you raised wine in Portugal and cloth, and so it worked reasonably well. But Keynes actually writes in an article on self-sufficiency in 1933, he says, except for natural resources and climate-oriented industries, every other industry can be equally efficient no matter where the firm puts it. In other words, he was talking about outsourcing of the cotton industry to India. Mm-hmm. And he says and that's not good, because all that does is move the jobs from one place to the other and creates unemployment. So he was against outsourcing in those days, and would have said the problem is for natural resources like fuel and things like that sort, or agricultural products. Mm-hmm. Comparative advantage might be good, but not for. And I had.
So what you would say is that the source of comparative advantage in agriculture are God-given.
That's right.
Not changeable endowments.
That's right.
Whereas in manufacturing, a process, a technology,
particularly,
you choose your comparative advantage as a matter of social policy. I know Ralph Gomery has been writing a lot about this. He and Will Baumol and Herb Scarf have written about the endogenous comparative advantage and the implications. And I even recall towards the end of his life, Paul Samuelson talked about the trade with countries at very different level of living standard, where technology could migrate, and that the formerly more developed country could be worse off for a very long time, following just the standard.
Just look at the Apple scandal with China. Mm-hmm. I mean, the labor, you moved all of the assembly of Apple products to China. Mm-hmm. And I used to teach my students, suppose we allowed China to build a factory in the United States and to operate it with child labor, 16-hour, no occupational health, instead of and polluting the atmosphere. The United States law would say you're not allowed to buy from that factory. Mm-hmm. Okay, American entrepreneurs could easily compete with the Chinese if we allow child labor. And
sure.
All these. So it's not that
the source of comparative advantage is the
it's
floor
a legal
is too
advantage.
Low for our society.
It's a legal advantage in the sense that we say, all right, if they do it in China, we'll buy from them. Mm-hmm. But if they do it in the United States, we won't. Well, that's nonsense. That's just a legal technicality. And the labor unions used to talk about leveling the playing field. Well, this is a legal leveling question, basically. Mm-hmm. And we shouldn't confuse it with the law of comparative advantage, which is what many people do.
Things that, like I said, God-given endowments that can't be altered.
Let me say one further thing on the balance of payments question. Keynes had this Keynes plan in which the credit of the nation took the wherewithal to solve the problem.
Was this his Bancor plan, as he called it?
It was a Bancor plan. He had a supranational central bank set up to do it. Well, we found out with the European Central Bank, supranational central banks can't always do it. But I have a variant in my book which uses the same principles without getting into the problem. First of all, we want each country to have its own central bank and its own control of monetary policy, which is not the European. Mm-hmm. We want each country to have its own control of fiscal policy, which is a little more European, but not perfectly. So you could get the Keynes plan without a supranational central bank And Keynes again said, we should not let the interest rate in country X affect what we need as the interest rate for full employment and so on in country Y. So we could adopt the Keynes plan, have globalization, and still have independent monetary policies depending on the country's economic circumstances. And we ought to. I mean, this is...
So what you're saying is you would not allow short-term capital mobility,
well,
but you would allow trade settlements.
Let me put it this way. You may need to have capital controls, okay? And everybody's shocked at that, except that I point out in the 1950s and 60s, including the United States, we had capital flow controls. Mm-hmm. And 50s and 60s were wonderful decades for all economies in the world. So capital controls is not a bad problem. One of the problems with trying to control the financial markets is derivatives and all this is guys on Wall Street say, well, if you put regulations like the Volcker Rule and so on, we'll just move over to the Cayman Islands, and set up a subsidiary, and we'll do everything out of the Cayman Islands. So you have to have some sort of protection because that's the equivalent of child labor. If you move the money, it's equivalent of saying, all right, it's all right to have child labor in the factories as long as it's in the Cayman Islands.
I wonder what kind of discount window they have in the Cayman Islands.
That's it.
Where's the Treasury to back that?
That's right.
There's a bit of a bluff to be called there, I suspect.
So we ought to think more globally, but think more in terms of our prosperity, and global prosperity will follow if everybody thinks that way.
Good. Well, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Rob,
and thanks
for giving me this
all
opportunity.
of the very fierce and independent work that you've done throughout your entire career. From the time I was 19 years old, I've learned a great deal from you, and it's a pleasure to be with you here today.
Good. That makes two of us at least that learned a lot from my writing.